Hello there, my name's Annette with Sunbeam Fabric Art. Welcome to my channel. I've got 12 classic cars I want to design and make. The first one I made was a Mustang. One thing I wanted to do was make the sky and the street consistent. So I did have to wait until I got some more of that fabric to make a few more cars. Once I had those two fabrics in my stash again, I picked out a darker gray for the tires, I picked out a black for the tires and underneath the car. I picked out a beautiful bright red batik for the main part of my Cadillac car. And a little pink fat quarter I picked up a long time ago I'm going to use for the highlight on the car. And one white 2.5-inch strip should be enough for the white areas on the hood of the roof of the car and the tires. As you can see from this little piece of pattern, which is one of the tire sections, actually it's two sections that create one tire, this pattern is very difficult. One of the sections has 30 pieces and many of them are very tiny. So if you're a beginner foundation paper piecer, I would not attempt this. Or if you do attempt it, blow it up to maybe 200% when you print it out, and that will make it a little easier, but your block would be twice as big. I picked up this red batik at a thrift store, and man, it is so pretty, but it was also very, very wrinkly. The first thing I do on assembling a pattern is I cut all the sections apart. Once I have them all cut apart and in a little stack, then I start cutting out individual pieces of fabric to go with each section. So for example, one of those tire sections that has 30 pieces in it, I will have 30 pieces of fabric stacked up with the little pattern piece on top. Now it's time to cut out some fabric for each section. The important thing to remember when you're cutting out fabric for a foundation paper pieced pattern, your pattern is right side up, your fabric is right side down, wrong side up, because we are sewing to the back of this paper and the right side of the image will be on the back of the paper. Once I have all the pieces for the section cut out and arranged in order, I stack up the fabric with the section paper on top, and I'm ready to go to the sewing machine. But I like to do the whole batch before I start. For this pattern, there's a white, there's a light gray, there's a dark gray. Some of those are hard to tell apart, so I put an L for light gray and a D for dark gray and a W for white on some of these pieces. So when I'm cutting out the fabric, I do choose the right color. Another thing I want to note, I leave myself a very generous seam allowance when I'm cutting out the pieces for these sections. Once I have all the sections stacked up, I folded up my extra fabric and put it back in my stash. I'm going to go through a little slowly on this section here, just so you can kind of see my method of doing the foundation paper piecing. Pieces 1 and 2 for this section are pretty small. I'm placing those right sides together, and I'm going to join that to the back of the paper with a 1.5-inch stitch length. I'm sewing directly on the seam line that separates piece 1 and piece 2. I do a couple of stitches before and a couple of stitches after. I trim all the threads away every addition. Next, I'll fold back the paper on the stitch line that I just stitched and trim away any excess bulk. This first seam doesn't have a lot, but subsequent pieces definitely will have some bulk to trim away. And then I'll press that seam open. Now it's time to add piece 3, so I place piece 3 right sides together on the back of the pattern so that it overlaps that stitch line, and then when I fold that open after I press the seam, it's going to cover that entire piece 3. I stitch that seam with the 1.5 stitch length, then I trim away all the excess threads, then I trim away excess bulk, then I press the seam open. Here I'm adding piece number 4 for this section. Now this piece had a little angle, so I cut an angle to kind of match that, and then when I place it on the back side of the pattern, that angle that I cut that matches the line is going to ensure this piece opens up correctly to cover that piece 4. Working with angles in foundation paper piecing is probably one of the most challenging things to wrap your mind around. For this section, the first 4 pieces were the most difficult. Now it's simply a matter of sewing the rest of the pieces, which there are only 4 more pieces for this one, just sewing them on straight lines and making sure there's enough fabric to cover the piece when it's pressed open. For piece number 6, I was having a little trouble seeing through that red fabric, so I folded the paper back on the stitch line and trimmed that red fabric to a 1/4 inch overlap. Then I could see exactly where to lay piece 6. Here, again, I was having trouble seeing through this dark fabric, so I trimmed that away to give myself that 1/4 inch seam allowance overlap. Then I was able to add my next piece of fabric, easily matching it up to that cut that I just made. Here's a look at that finished section with all 8 pieces attached. It will need to be trimmed later on. I'm going to do a bit of skipping around here. I wanted to show you one of the pitfalls of having a pattern with lots of tiny pieces, and that is with multiple perforations going on, these pieces can tend to fall apart. So I'll use some Scotch tape to tape down everything and keep it in the right place as I continue sewing and adding more and more pieces. I'm going to take you through a close-up of adding piece number 9 to this tricky pattern piece. I'm going to place this piece 9 right sides together on the back side here, and it's going to overlap that line between 9 and the bigger numbers. Once that overlaps and I'm sure of its placement, I'm going to stitch that line. I'm going to fold back the paper on the line that I just stitched, and I'm making sure I'm trimming away towards the bigger numbers. I've done it backwards before and trimmed off everything that I had stitched before and had to start completely over with a section. So just make sure you're trimming away the things that are pointing towards the higher numbers. And with all the pieces I do trim all the threads every time and press that seam open. Here's a look at that piece 9 that I just added. I've got my finger there so you can kind of see how small some of these pieces are. One common mistake you'll make when foundation paper piecing is this one right here, where you sew the fabric wrong side to right side. In this case, however, look at the back of this dark gray fabric. It really isn't noticeable. I decided, you know what, I don't think that's going to matter in the grand scheme of things, so I did not remove that piece that was sewed on incorrectly. I just left it there, and you'll see in the finished car that it looks just fine. That won't happen with every fabric. And when you're sewing with a 1.5 stitch length, it is a pain to pick out those stitches, so I recommend just caution every time you add a piece. For this pattern, I also wanted to point out some of the pieces were so tiny, I felt better on the PDF pattern putting that number on the outside of the actual piece so you could see the number. Here's another closer look at one of those angle pieces. I laid the fabric wrong side up on top of the pattern and tried to cut that angle exactly to match the stitch line. Then when I place it on the back side of the fabric and stitch the line, when I open that up, it should cover the piece. And here's a look at another section that's finished except for trimming. I also wanted to show you the hardest section here. This one had 30 pieces, I believe. Yeah, very tiny pieces. I've got probably 6 layers of Scotch tape on there. With all the sections done, it's time to trim each one to that dotted line, which is the seam allowance line. For larger pieces, I'll lay those flat on my cutting mat and just use a ruler and a rotary cutter to cut on the dotted line. With smaller pieces, I will just hold them in my hand and trim with scissors. At this point, I've got all the sections ready to assemble, and I've got a sticky note here with my instructions on how to assemble the car. Well, we're going to start with section A and section B, putting those together. That's the top and the bottom of a tire. You can see how the center of the tire should line up. I use clips to clip this in place along where the stitch line will be. Then I can open that up before I actually stitch it and make sure the things that need to line up will be lining up. Once I stitched those two pieces together, these have such tiny, tiny pieces, I wanted to go ahead and remove all the paper from these. Sometimes on a maybe an easier paper piece pattern, you might want to leave the paper in as you sew and then remove all the paper at the end. But for these patterns that have all these tiny pieces, I really prefer, for any seam that's going to get enclosed again or anything that doesn't need that guideline, I try to get rid of the paper as I go along. Piece A and B went together really smoothly. I'm pleased with that. I continued along assembling my sections together in the order of my instructions. Here is where I am joining piece A and B, which have already been joined, to D, E, F, G, and H. And we do have some lines that really should match up if at all possible. And here I've skipped ahead almost to the end. I just have one more seam to stitch. Now this one was a little tricky. That white hard top, I just couldn't get it to line up exactly, but that's okay. It was a choice between lining up that pink fabric and the white fabric below, or the white hard top. So I chose to try, and I tried to squeeze that white hard top in, but it just didn't work out. So the hard top was off about 1/8 of an inch. Now for me, it wasn't a big deal because I have lots and lots of Sharpie markers and fabric markers. I was able to find a green that was pretty close to my sky fabric, and I just fudged that little overlap there on the white top of this Cadillac. And here is that finished Cadillac car. I'll leave information about how long it took me in the description. The block measures 14 inches across by 9 inches high. Now here it is before I used the Sharpie, and here it is after I put a little dot of Sharpie right there on the corner. Wow, that made a difference. I love it. I'm glad I keep lots of fabric color markers. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I do hope to see you back again real soon.